Hey guys, tonight we're unraveling a thread you probably never thought to follow. Down the pant leg of a French military officer, around a calf muscle honed by years of marching, and into one of the most peculiar obsessions of Napoleon's inner circle: socks. Not just any socks, mind you. We're talking ornate, embroidered, lavender-scented wonders. Socks fit not just for generals, but for jealous peacocks. Picture rows of hardened, battle-scarred men debating the superiority of silk versus fine wool, while cannonballs echoed in the distance. You're standing at the edge of a battlefield in 1805, watching the Grande Armée array itself like a well-rehearsed opera. Sabers glint, drums beat, and boots stomp in elegant synchrony. But beneath those boots, especially for the officers, you'd often find socks that cost more than a peasant's yearly income. Why? Because in Napoleonic France, what clung to your ankles was not a mere undergarment. It was a statement of rank, refinement, and occasionally your chances of romance. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like sharing, post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're all listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge behind the officers' column, and the click of heels on gravel is oddly delicate, like someone performing a dance routine in a war zone. These are not just boots over socks. These are Hessian boots flaring just enough at the top to reveal a teasing sliver of pastel blue cashmere. It's the sock equivalent of a wink. The sock obsession didn't bloom overnight. It was a product of Enlightenment elegance clashing with revolutionary chaos. Before Napoleon, powdered wigs and buckled shoes reigned supreme. But underneath it all, noblemen already treated hosiery as a quiet competition. Flashy socks were a subtle rebellion against otherwise identical uniforms, and under Napoleon's militarized regime, that tradition didn't just survive, it flourished. French officers were allowed a fair bit of flair, particularly in their leisure wear. The rules of uniformity were precise, yes, but only above the knee. The area below? That was a tantalizing zone of semi-regulated freedom. So officers flaunted their fashion literacy with Scottish plaids, Italian weaves, and, if they were feeling particularly bold, handmade Egyptian cotton numbers allegedly plundered during Napoleon's 1798 campaign. Historians still argue whether those Egyptian socks were real or just exotic fibbing, but that didn't stop officers from bragging. And brag they did. In letters home, officers waxed poetic about ivory-threaded instep guards and delicately ribbed silk. These weren't battlefield reports. They were sock diaries. One captain wrote more about his argyle-patterned stockings than the condition of his battalion. This might sound absurd, but imagine months in a lice-ridden camp. Your socks are one of the few things separating you from the itch of the world. There was also the matter of scent. You might expect damp leather and horse to be the prevailing fragrance. But no. Officers sprinkled lavender oil inside their socks. Some even lined them with dried herbs to mask foot stench. And if that sounds extra, remember, this was the era of perfumed gloves, monogrammed kerchiefs, and people painting beauty marks on with charcoal and beeswax. Socks were just another extension of one's curated personal scent trail. Now, Napoleon himself was something of a pragmatist when it came to dress. He favored simple gray overcoats and hats worn at a tilt. But even he wasn't immune to the allure of elegant hosiery. There are accounts of him inspecting an officer's attire and pausing to comment, favorably or otherwise, on sock selection. One unlucky fellow wore mismatched grays and earned a muttered, "Your feet are confused, Lieutenant." Ouch. But for most officers, these socks were armor, not against bullets, but against anonymity. In a rigid hierarchy where everyone saluted the same way and ate from the same dull mess tin, the right pair of socks could make you unforgettable at a dinner party or a field review. There's even a story, though possibly apocryphal, about a junior officer promoted partially because his sock game impressed a visiting dignitary. Naturally, imitation flourished. Tailors near military camps specialized in what they called officers' hosiery, which included reinforced heels, hidden pockets, yes, sock pockets, and hand-stitched initials. Soldiers gossiped about who had a new shipment of hosiery, as if they were discussing rations or rifle upgrades. This wasn't just fashion. It was a mild form of class warfare, played out in wool and satin. What's more, there was practical logic behind the drama. Socks had to be durable. Marching through marshes, over cobblestones, and across freezing fields meant your footwear took a beating. Blisters could lead to infections, and infections could lead to amputations. So the sock you chose literally walked the line between style and survival. Still, some choices were purely flamboyant. Take General Junot, for instance, a man so obsessed with appearance, he once commissioned socks dyed with crushed violets. Yes, his feet were purple. Was it tactical? Absolutely not. Was it fabulous? Oh yes. It's hard to imagine a modern general worrying about sock embroidery while orchestrating a siege, but in Napoleon's day, that embroidered cuff peeking from your boot might be the only visible marker of status in a smoky command tent. It was as if a sock could whisper, "Yes, I command respect," and also, "Yes, I moisturize." So as the army marches on, its banners flying and sabers flashing, just remember, beneath it all, tucked under layers of linen and leather, beats the soft, cashmere-clad heart of Napoleonic fashion. The socks didn't simply appear in officers' trunks by magic, of course. No enchanted foot fairies fluttered through the barracks at night. Each lacy, lavender-lined masterpiece had to be sourced, woven, and delivered through a sock supply chain so elaborate it would make a modern logistics officer weep into their spreadsheets. You're seated on a creaky wooden cart, somewhere in the back alleys of Paris, watching a wiry apprentice knit a pair of delicate, cream-colored stockings by hand. Each stitch is tighter than a drum, done by candlelight, and the wool is spun from sheep bred in specific mountain regions for softness. This isn't military equipment. This is artisanry. And the clients? Officers of Napoleon's Grande Armée, men who ordered their socks like aristocrats once ordered portraits, individually tailored, monogrammed, and delivered in bundles tied with ribbon. The trade routes supplying these socks could span hundreds of miles, from the looms of Lyon to the ribbon factories of Rouen. These dainty foot sheaths passed through merchants, packagers, and occasionally smugglers. Officers stationed far from Paris placed custom orders with letters describing their calf circumference and arch shape. One quartermaster's log from 1807 actually lists hosiery preferences by officer which included notes like prefers longer rise, favors blue stripes, and puzzlingly requires toe reinforcement for fencing mishaps. This level of customization wasn't just vanity. The wrong sock could mean chafing, slippage, or worse, visible bunching, the cardinal sin of officer fashion. A well-fitted sock allowed boots to glide on effortlessly, essential when you might have to mount a horse mid-skirmish. Historians still argue whether this emphasis on fit was learned from the cavalry, or if it developed independently among dandy foot soldiers desperate for a moment of control in a chaotic world. Getting the socks to the front lines, though, was another saga. Supply wagons had to carry more than musket balls and moldy hardtack. Hidden in crates beneath salted pork and gun oil were bundles of silk and cotton, often wrapped in muslin and perfumed to deter rats. Sometimes, the socks were slipped into diplomatic pouches to avoid theft. Yes, officers' socks were considered high-risk loot. There are reports of entire packages going missing en route, only to be spotted weeks later on the feet of a rival battalion's captain. In winter campaigns, such as the March into Russia in 1812, the sock situation grew critical. Wool stocks ran low, silk was utterly useless against frostbite, and officers began hoarding thick knitted stockings like squirrels with acorns. One lieutenant from the Imperial Guard wrote a desperate plea home. "I would trade 2 bottles of brandy for a pair of your grandmother's woolies." That letter, by the way, is now housed in a museum next to, what else? A pair of knitted socks allegedly sewn by his grandmother. To meet demand, entire cottage industries popped up in occupied territories. In northern Italy, Belgian lace makers turned to sock work. In Bavaria, peasants were paid to knit rougher service-grade stockings under military contract. The sock became an economic microcosm of the Napoleonic Empire, a delicate product crossing harsh terrain to cradle the pampered foot of power. It wasn't just about keeping officers happy. There were occasional attempts to regulate sock logistics. Napoleon's quartermasters issued standardized lists of what each rank was permitted to order. Captains, for example, could have 2 fine pairs for formal occasions and 3 rougher pairs for daily use. Generals were, predictably, exempt from most restrictions, and some of them took full advantage. Marshal Ney allegedly ordered 50 pairs before the Russian campaign. 50. For one man. For one set of feet. That's not a supply list. It's a sock dynasty. Of course, not all went smoothly. Delays were frequent. One especially bold supplier once included a poem inside a delivery that read, "The roads were blocked, my cart was slow, but here's your socks, as white as snow." Charming, yes, but the captain who received them was not amused. He was already on his 3rd week of barefoot fencing drills due to lack of proper gear. You can imagine the sarcasm in his reply. Still, some officers used their influence to prioritize sock shipments over arguably more important supplies. One scandal in 1809 saw a high-ranking quartermaster court-martialed. After it was discovered, he rerouted a wool shipment from a medical station to his brother's regiment, just so they could have matching socks for an upcoming inspection. Historians still argue whether this was mere vanity or a morale-building strategy. Maybe both. And morale mattered. A clean, snug, well-scented sock could give a soldier just enough comfort to face another miserable march. It reminded them of home, of elegance, of a world where people cared about your toes. Napoleon himself said, "An army marches on its stomach, but judging from supply lists, it might have marched just as confidently on its socks." So you find yourself drifting along with the wagons, bumping over frozen ruts, as crates of hosiery make their way to officers desperate for a touch of refinement amidst the madness. In this strange war of muskets and manners, where powder burns mingled with perfume, it was entirely normal to find a hardened colonel yelling not about strategy, but about how someone creased the toe seam. Fancy socks, it turns out, weren't just stitched with silk. They were woven with pride, power, and a small, stubborn hope that even in the muddiest of wars, your ankles could remain immaculate. You're crouched behind a row of tents somewhere near Austerlitz, pretending to inspect musket flints. But really, you're watching two officers argue over something you can't quite believe. Sock embroidery. One is insisting that his new pair from Paris bears the more authentic fleur-de-lis pattern, while the other accuses him of wearing Provençal peasant knockoffs. Welcome to the high-stakes world of sock envy, where insults are flung with the same ferocity as cannonballs, just with more silk involved. In the tight social pyramid of the French military elite, sock choice became shorthand for status, taste, and political leanings. Officers were supposed to dress within regulation, but those rules had more loopholes than a cheesecloth. The regulation might say neutral tones, but what exactly counted as neutral when your socks were dyed in alpine herbs and subtly shimmering in gold thread? Historians still argue whether Napoleon's vague dress codes were deliberate leniency or just a sign he really didn't care what people wore below the knees. But his officers cared, deeply. Sock envy was rampant in regiments where everyone was vying for a promotion, a commendation, or at least a few admiring glances during mealtime. If your comrade got a delivery of imported Scottish wool socks and you were still trudging about in ration-issued grays, you could bet your last shilling he'd make a show of airing them casually outside his tent flap like some aristocratic foot peacock. Some soldiers even started tracking whose socks drew the most compliments, creating unofficial best-dressed rankings in their battalions. It's a small wonder nobody invented a sock-based dueling system. Although one officer allegedly challenged a comrade to a fencing match after being called a striped-footed try-hard. For the record, neither party lost their dignity, but one did lose a very expensive pair of hose to a muddy puddle mid-duel. What made socks such powerful status symbols was the sheer impracticality of the fanciest pairs. A delicate silk stocking embroidered with thread of silver wasn't meant to be marched in. It was designed to be seen, preferably while lounging in an officer's salon, ankle-propped casually atop a stool, perhaps while quoting Virgil and sipping brandy. These were peacetime socks worn during wartime, and their wearers hoped everyone around them noticed. And notice they did. Officers of lower rank or lesser income often eyed the socked elite with a mix of resentment and admiration. Sock envy wasn't just about the accessory. It was about everything the socks represented. Access to money, connections back in Paris, and the leisure time to care whether your ankle thread matched your cuff braid. For some, it symbolized hope. For others, it felt like a cruel reminder that even war couldn't flatten every hierarchy. there were even rumors of sabotage. Stories circulated of rival officers spilling wine accidentally on prized hosiery, or switching a well-placed laundry line to expose someone's threadbare emergency pair. These aren't well-documented events, but given the gossip-fueled culture of the time, it's not hard to imagine. After all, this was an army where one general reportedly scolded a subordinate not for a tactical error, but for clashing sock and sash colors during a formal inspection. And oh, the colors. While many modern depictions of the Napoleonic Wars bathe everything in grayscale mud and musket smoke, the truth was far more flamboyant. Officers wore socks in burgundy, emerald, violet, and every other shade that suggested expensive taste and questionable practicality. One captain from the 12th Dragoons wore lemon yellow knee-highs, so often he was nicknamed the buttered calf. Military artists of the era even leaned into this aesthetic. Portraits of officers, especially the more vain among them, frequently include a leg jutting ever so slightly forward, an ankle turned just enough to reveal the finely ribbed sock below. These weren't accidents. They were visual flexes. And as with all fashionable posturing, imitation ran rampant. Merchants began marketing Napoleonic officer José to civilians, claiming they were worn by the victorious heroes of Europe. Whether or not this was true didn't matter. If an urban bourgeois gentleman could walk through Paris with a bit of that officer's swagger peeking from his boots, he would, and did. Fashion and war had become inseparable, stitched together with two-ply thread and a healthy dose of masculine vanity. And what about Napoleon? Did he disapprove of all this strutting? Not exactly. While he wasn't personally flamboyant, he understood the political value of appearance. A well-dressed officer inspired confidence. Elegance implied control. The public needed to believe that even amid the chaos of war, France's best men were composed, polished, and dashing, right down to their toes. Still, sock envy occasionally veered into absurdity. In one documented instance, an aide-de-camp reported a skirmish being delayed when a major refused to ride out until his laundry arrived. The reason? He refused to be seen in undignified woolens by the enemy. Whether this was actual pride or a clever dodge from danger, we'll never know. So as you lounge with these bickering sock snobs, you realize something. Under the brocade and bravado, these officers are still very human. In the face of frostbite, marching blisters, and cannonball anxiety, they cling to something small and soft, a bit of style, a scrap of identity. Fancy socks were a form of battlefield control, a way of saying, the world may be on fire, but my ankles are composed. You're standing now on the edge of a muddy field somewhere in Saxony, watching a group of officers prepare for a dawn march. They're tugging on their boots with that familiar combination of grunts, sighs, and not-so-subtle groans about yesterday's rations. But listen closely, and you'll hear something else. Little complaints about thread tension, itchy arches, or the disgrace of a sock sliding down during cavalry charges. In this army, socks weren't just fashion, they were function, and the line between the two was as thin as a silk toe seam. At first glance, it seems preposterous that such a dainty item could have any battlefield relevance, but when you spend 16 hours a day on your feet, riding, walking, or standing at attention, even a tiny fold in your sock could turn into a chafing wound the size of a wine cork. good socks prevented blisters, supported arches, and, perhaps most importantly, kept you dry. Moisture meant trench foot. Trench foot meant amputation. Suddenly, that rose-colored stocking doesn't seem quite so frivolous. Historians still argue whether the obsession with tailored socks came from necessity or pure vanity, because the results were so delightfully ambiguous. Officers wore fine socks because they could, but also because the alternatives were horrifying. State-issued stockings were coarse, inconsistently sized, and often so loosely knit that an entire toe might poke through by lunchtime. And in the mud of a battlefield, a toe sticking out wasn't just embarrassing, it was dangerous. Enter the double-threaded cavalry sock, a glorious compromise between flair and function. Reinforced heels, padded balls, and a snug fit from toe to knee. This was the Rolls-Royce of footgear. Commissioned officers often paid extra for handmade pairs that hugged their calves with gentle elasticity. One infantry colonel allegedly had his socks designed with alternating bands of tension to reduce fatigue in one leg he claimed was philosophically weaker. Yes, philosophically. War made everyone a little strange. These weren't just socks. They were wearable strategy. Certain weaves kept warmth in better than others, and some had thicker soles to prevent foot fatigue during long marches. Others had slits along the side, like secret vents, to help airflow beneath the boot. The innovations might seem minor, but when your day involves mud, snow, and the occasional bayonet duel, a bit of ankle comfort could mean everything. Napoleon's logistical minds knew this too. There are surviving notes from his quartermasters discussing sock fabrics alongside musket ball distribution. It's all very dry. Recommend shipment of 2,000 linen pairs for Lemberg garrison. But between the lines you can sense the desperation. Winter campaigns were hell on feet. Warm socks weren't optional. They were survival gear. Cold, wet, blistered feet turned officers into liabilities, not leaders. One lesser-known logistical miracle was the introduction of boot liners, thin inner socks made of oiled silk, worn beneath thicker wool pairs to prevent moisture intrusion. Think of them as foot umbrellas. These were particularly prized during Alpine crossings, and there's a charmingly bitter letter from an officer who misplaced his pair and accused his tentmate of covert theft by means of sleep sliding. That's right. He thought someone stole his liners by nudging them off his feet while he slept. The function of socks also extended into morale. When you've got nothing but gray skies and cold stew for weeks, the simple act of pulling on a clean, luxurious pair of stockings could reset your brain chemistry. That tug of silk up your leg, the subtle scent of clove oil from a pocket sachet, the satisfying tension against your skin. It was a small, private ritual that reminded you, I am still human. I am still whole. Naturally, some socks pushed the envelope of practicality. One marshal had his entire wardrobe altered to accommodate a personal belief that only socks of precisely 11 inches height ensured optimal circulation. Tailors rolled their eyes, subordinates whispered, but he swore by it, and to be fair, he did survive 3 campaigns without so much as a sprained ankle. Coincidence? Perhaps. But superstition and practicality often shared a bunk in Napoleonic tents. Others believed specific dyes improved performance. Crimson socks, one general claimed, invigorated the blood. Blue calmed the nerves. Green, well, no one was quite sure what green did, but it made you look like you'd been somewhere exotic. Sock color became an unofficial signal for mood, experience, and sometimes just how much laundry someone had managed to get done that week. Then there were event socks. These were not meant for battle, but for parades, speeches, and those awkward formal dinners in drafty chateaus. Officers kept them pristine in special wax-lined boxes, complete with sachets and tiny polishing brushes. Imagine pausing in the middle of planning a siege to buff your toe embroidery. And yet, that happened. A diary from one junior officer recounts a morning where his entire division was delayed 20 minutes because a general couldn't find his silver-threaded left sock. The horror. And of course, just as socks protected feet, they occasionally served as emotional armor. One widowed captain wrote in his journal that he only wore a certain pair of lavender and cream-striped stockings on days he knew would be hard. They were her favorite, he noted simply. He wore them at Auerstedt, through cannon smoke and grief. So, as the boots march again across frosted grass, you realize the sock, so often ignored, so easily underestimated, was no mere accessory. It was an interface between skin and world, a tiny, intimate rebellion against discomfort, a source of confidence, comfort, and connection to life before war. And beneath every buckle, braid, and boot, there it sat, a piece of home, hugging the foot of someone trying, desperately, to keep walking forward. The battlefield might have been soaked in mud and glory, but back at camp, something else soaked through the air: lavender, rose water, and the quiet rustle of parchment. You're now sitting beside a flickering lantern, flipping through a stack of officers' letters, and what catches your eye isn't tactical brilliance or stirring heroism. It's socks. Sock descriptions so vivid, you can practically feel the ribbed wool under your fingers. That's right. The men of the Grande Armée didn't just wear fancy socks. They wrote love letters about them. "Your stockings remain my one comfort," wrote one lovesick officer to his fiancée, "and I wear them as if they still carry your warmth." Another noted that the lilac pair she sent had survived a river crossing, a musket misfire, and the disappointment of rations. "They, unlike my subordinates, have not let me down." It sounds romantic, ridiculously so. But in truth, these socks were tangible links to lives left behind. A fine pair knitted by a lover or mother wasn't just an object. It was a portable memory. Historians still argue whether this deep emotional attachment to clothing was a Napoleonic-era anomaly or just a continuation of older, more sentimental habits. What's certain is this: many of these men carried more hand-washed hosiery than ammunition. Some even composed entire poetic verses dedicated to their socks. One awkward verse from a lieutenant goes, "Thou art snug upon my heel, more faithful than my horse, more constant than my meals." It didn't win any awards, but you have to admire the devotion. A few officers even tucked locks of hair into their sock cuffs, hidden from view but pressed against the skin. A strange, sweaty love token only a soldier could romanticize. And then there were the care packages. Lovers and families knew exactly what to send. Stockings infused with lavender oil, lined with fleece, or embroidered with initials and little stitched messages along the band, tiny prayers or inside jokes, hidden where only the wearer would see. One particularly cheeky wife reportedly stitched, Don't flirt with the laundress into her husband's pair. We don't know if it worked. Socks were also the perfect vessels for scented sachets, crushed herbs tied in cloth, sewn discreetly inside, bay leaves, thyme, even cloves, each serving the dual purpose of fragrance and anti-rot. Some officers swore their perfumed toes gave them a mental edge, and one diary even describes a strange ritual involving sock sniffing before duels. It sounds ridiculous now, but in an age where hygiene was precarious and superstition was rampant, these little rituals gave structure to chaos. But the romanticism of socks wasn't limited to love. There's a whole genre of letters written from officer to comrade, praising a particular pair or lamenting a loss. "Gone are my striped allies," wrote one man after a streamside laundry disaster, swept away by Neptune himself. You can practically hear the heartbreak. Another man, assigned to Austria, sent home sketches of new sock trends he'd seen in Vienna, including a daring checkerboard pattern. "Might be scandalous," he wrote, "but I am tempted." Even in captivity, socks were a source of pride and longing. French officers held in Britain after various defeats often traded valuables, combs, tobacco, even buttons, for a fresh pair of stockings. One prisoner, according to a camp record, offered a full bottle of port for some gently worn lavender wool. Whether it was the softness or the scent that moved him, we may never know. There's also the mysterious case of the matchmaker pair, a superstition among junior officers that if you wore hand-knit socks sent by a sweetheart during inspection, you'd receive good news from home. The origin of this belief is murky, but it spread fast. So much so that officers started requesting socks timed with mail arrivals, hoping for a double dose of luck. It rarely worked, but the optimism stitched into those requests is touching nonetheless. In some cases, sock-based sentimentality veered into the theatrical. An officer known only as Captain D reportedly carried a tiny velvet pouch of threads from every pair his wife sent. He claimed they helped him sleep. Another arranged his clean socks like trophies along the inside of his tent flap, not to air them, but to be near her artistry, as he put it. And lest you think this was a purely French phenomenon, visiting diplomats and even enemies began taking note. A British general observing a French camp once remarked, "They sleep on rocks and dine on gravel, yet their ankles are more stylish than my drawing room guests." Say what you will about the Grande Armée, they marched with flair. So here you are, sitting by the firelight, reading the sock-soaked love stories of men who wore their hearts somewhere near their ankles. The letters fade, the flames flicker, and the scent of dried lavender lingers in the air. In the chaos of war, these small, ridiculous, beautiful things mattered, perhaps more than we'll ever fully understand. And as strange as it may sound, those very socks, striped, scented, sentimental, helped keep the soul intact. You're trudging now through the chilly dusk of a makeshift camp near Leipzig. The air smells like sweat, gunpowder, and boiled onions. But there's something else in the air, too. Rumors. One whispers down the line like a campfire secret. An officer was robbed. Not of coin, not of medals, but of his best socks. Yes, someone snuck into his tent and pinched a pair of powder blue silk stockings right out of his trunk. The man is inconsolable. His comrades are outraged. And somewhere out there, a thief is enjoying luxury between their toes. Sock theft was no laughing matter. In Napoleon's army, these weren't just accessories, they were treasure. It wasn't uncommon for officers to lock their sock trunks with small padlocks or hide them under their bedrolls. One artillery captain reportedly slept with his finest pair tucked beneath his shako. That's a hat for the uninitiated, because he feared both fire and thieves, and he was right to worry. Sock envy sometimes spilled into genuine larceny. Captured officers had it even worse. Once taken prisoner, they became instant targets, not just for interrogation or humiliation, but for plunder. British and Prussian troops joked that French officers wore their fortunes below the knee, and some reportedly made a sport of unbooting their captives to see what extravagant hosiery lay beneath. One French prisoner was said to weep not from fear, but because they took the pair she made for me. Historians still argue whether this particular prisoner was exaggerating, or whether the sock had sentimental value beyond description. Either way, it illustrates a strange wartime truth. The things we cling to when everything else is stripped away are often the silliest, softest, and most personal. And sometimes you cling to them too tightly, like the lieutenant who once refused to surrender until he had successfully stuffed both socks into his hat. A guard reportedly asked, "Why the hat?" To which he replied, "The boots were too obvious." Trade among prisoners of war also revolved, surprisingly often, around hosiery. Officers with more connections back home could request supplies, luxury soap, chocolates, and of course, socks, and then barter them within the prisoner population. A good wool pair could fetch a tin of sardines or 2 cigars. A silk pair? You could ask for nearly anything. Writing paper, decent wine, or even bribes to guards. There's an especially curious account of one French officer trading a set of embroidered stockings for a small watercolor portrait of his dog, painted by a fellow inmate. "He walks beside me in brushstroke," the officer wrote, "and beneath me in thread." A little ridiculous, perhaps. But then again, men clung to identity however they could. Sock theft wasn't limited to enemy hands, though. Among comrades, things got sneakier. Laundry lines stretched between tents like garlands of pastel wool and linen, and socks were known to mysteriously vanish. Borrowing was common, especially among officers who had overspent on embroidery and under-budgeted for actual spares. One infamously dandyish general had his initials sewn in invisible thread, visible only under candlelight, just so he could identify a thief in the night. Whether it worked is unclear, but the drama? Immaculate. You could always spot the most paranoid among the ranks. They kept their socks tucked into their bedrolls, triple knotted in canvas pouches, or folded in secret compartments inside writing desks. One enterprising tailor designed an officer's greatcoat with sock sleeves, hidden inner pockets expressly for emergency pairs. It was considered wildly impractical until he successfully smuggled 6 pairs out of a burning barracks. Then there were the ruses. Officers traveling to Paris on leave were known to exaggerate their sock losses to families in order to get fresh, lovingly made replacements. One letter reads, "Dearest Margot, my last surviving pair was claimed by mud and fire. If you could see your way to sending another batch, perhaps 2 pairs, one in violet, I would sleep easier." The very next page of his journal, of course. notes that he still had 4 pairs and was simply bored of gray. Sometimes, the obsession with socks verged on the absurd. After the Battle of Wagram, one officer refused to leave his tent during a rainstorm because he'd already laid out his parade pair and didn't want to risk spotting. His comrades left without him. He arrived late, immaculate from the knee down, and was immediately scolded by a general with muddy breeches and absolutely no patience for hosiery-related delays. Still, some accounts say the general asked where he'd gotten them afterward. Let's not forget wartime looting, either. Officers occupying cities often made straight for haberdasheries and tailors, sometimes requisitioning socks as essential military supplies. One Parisian merchant reportedly had a sign that read, "We do not serve officers who pretend their socks are for strategic defense." It didn't help. In Berlin, a whole sock shop was emptied overnight by officers celebrating a recent victory. The locals were confused. The officers? Very cozy. There's even evidence that rival armies started mocking the French for their sock fixation. British caricaturists published cartoons showing Napoleon with oversized stockings and tiny feet, while Austrian broadsides claimed French generals would rather save their embroidery than their men. This backfired somewhat when British officers started importing French hosiery styles shortly after, because mockery only lasts until you try on silk socks. So as the camp grows quiet and the last lanterns flicker out, you understand something odd but oddly human. In a world defined by blood, mud, and fire, socks offered a strange kind of comfort. Whether stolen, bartered, hidden, or hoarded, they were soft reminders of selfhood, little luxuries clutched tight in the dark. The morning inspection is underway, and you're watching the officers line up like a row of exquisitely painted chess pieces, each hoping his boots, and, more importantly, the sliver of sock that peeks out from beneath, pass silent judgment. You might think that military dress regulations left no room for flair, but you'd be mistaken. In fact, beneath the surface of polished buttons and immaculate sashes, a secret war was always waging, the war between regulation and ruffles. Military dress codes in the Napoleonic era were famously detailed, but also riddled with gray areas, especially when it came to what lurked beneath the boots. While jackets had to be buttoned, epaulets squared, and swords carried at precise angles, socks received comparatively vague guidelines. Stockings of neutral tone and material consistent with campaign use, one regulation read, which in officer speak meant, make it look just subtle enough to be technically legal. And so, the creativity bloomed. Officers took these gaps in clarity as permission, nay, invitation, to push the limits of flair. Historians still argue whether this widespread sock rebellion was passive resistance, self-expression, or simply collective boredom turned fashionable. Whatever the cause, it turned uniform inspection into a low-stakes game of cat and mouse. Could you slip in a bit of scalloped lace without getting caught? Would that fine silver embroidery pass as gray in the right light? Some officers went so far as to create what they called inspection pairs, socks designed to look boring from the outside, but flamboyant on the inside. Fold them down, and you'd see blush pink lining, perhaps even initials stitched in gold. Fold them up, and suddenly, they were just another regulation gray. It was the sartorial equivalent of hiding a secret tattoo, thrilling, pointless, and totally irresistible. Naturally, enforcement varied wildly. Some commanders had no patience for sock drama. Others participated themselves. One general reportedly had 12 pairs made to match his horse's saddlecloth, claiming it pleased the symmetry of his soul. Another once stopped an entire review to point out that a junior officer's sock had the texture of undercooked gruel. He was demoted the next day, not for disobedience, but for bringing disgrace to the ankle. And then there were those who challenged the rules outright. The infamous Rouen incident involved a whole regiment of officers conspiring to wear flamboyant socks in protest of a recent pay cut. They showed up to drill wearing striped, polka-dotted, and even tasseled stockings. One sergeant sewed miniature bells into his cuff seams. It was a silent protest, if by silent you mean a parade of jingling defiance, and the general reportedly burst out laughing before quietly doubling their sock allowance the following month. Sock-related defiance also played a part in more subtle forms of political theater. Loyal Bonapartists were rumored to wear socks with discreet eagle motifs, while those leaning toward the Bourbons preferred fleur-de-lis stitchwork. You wouldn't see it unless they wanted you to, but it was there, twitching at the edge of the boot, like a whispered allegiance. Fashion as subversion, with the foot as canvas. This political dimension wasn't just paranoia. Artists, too, picked up on the trend. In several portraits from the late Empire period, you'll spot socks rendered in more detail than rifles. One famous painting of Marshal Murat, best known for his impossibly dramatic uniforms, shows him standing in a cascade of velvet and gold. But it's the inch of peacock blue stocking at his ankle that steals the show. That wasn't an accident. It was the painter tipping his brush to sock culture. Sock ruffles, for their part, deserve special mention. Though largely impractical, some officers insisted on wearing softly gathered lace at the sock's edge, just barely visible above the boot. Technically frowned upon, these ruffles were considered the height of rakish elegance. They fluttered as one walked, like tiny triumphant flags. One captain wrote that he believed the lace added momentum and morale to his stride. Science disagrees, but his tailor certainly didn't. Of course, not everyone found sock theatrics amusing. Some critics, particularly older officers hardened by years of real campaigning, saw it as nonsense. General Masséna once allegedly growled, "A man who spends more than a minute dressing his ankle should be demoted to footman." Ironically, he was later buried wearing silk stockings, allegedly a request made in jest, or perhaps not. And it wasn't just men. While women didn't serve in the ranks, many took up arms in another way, through the needle. Seamstresses and wives played a quiet role in this rebellion, hand-sewing socks that looked regulation on the outside and outrageous within. Hearts, initials, love notes, and even political symbols found their way into ankle embroidery, hidden from superiors but close to the skin. Some of these were confiscated during inspections and stored as non-regulation items in dusty trunks. Today, they sit in museum collections across Europe, pristine reminders of an era where defying authority could be as simple as stitching something forbidden in blue thread beneath a soldier's boot. And so, as the inspection continues, you find yourself watching not just for polished sabers or straight sashes, but for that slight shimmer of color, the cheeky flicker of silk peeking from a cuff. It's a dance, really. A quiet rebellion done entirely with fabric. No shouting, no riots. just 1,000 men standing tall, knowing full well their ankles are committing soft, luxurious mutiny. The painter dabs his brush gently against the canvas, squinting at the man in front of him. Not at the epaulets, not at the saber or medals or chin, but at the socks. That perfect glimmering arc of pale green silk barely peeking from the boot. You're watching history be immortalized, one ankle at a time. By the early 19th century, socks had marched far beyond the trenches and into the world of portraiture and propaganda. Artists, whether consciously or simply swept along by fashion, began to treat hosiery as a mark of taste and character. A dandy ankle hinted at refinement. A disciplined, modest cuff suggested stoicism. And those flamboyant bits of toe-peaking finery? They were declarations. It might sound ridiculous until you realize how carefully officers staged these paintings. Everything was deliberate, from the cut of the coat to the slope of the boot. But more than once, letters survive where men specifically requested that their portrait show a glimpse of the embroidered instep, or the garter band, visible just so. Historians still argue whether this was about pride, personal branding, or just the 1800s version of thirst trapping. Possibly all three. One of the most famous sock moments in Napoleonic art comes from an 1811 portrait of General Lasalle, known for his wild behavior and even wilder wardrobe. There, amid all the glory and regalia, is a tiny flash of scarlet stocking beneath his right boot, intended, according to some accounts, as a romantic gesture to his mistress. Others think it was a jab at a rival officer with famously dull sock tastes. Either way, it worked. Everyone noticed. Napoleon, for his part, was usually depicted in a more restrained palette: grays, navy, somber blacks. But even he wasn't immune to the propaganda value of well-shod feet. A few portraits show him seated, leg crossed, with a barely perceptible band of white silk sock gleaming at the ankle. Clean, crisp, commanding. Not flashy, just immaculate. Which, if you were trying to inspire confidence in your empire, was precisely the look. These images weren't just for the history books. They were copied. Engravings and prints of France's victorious generals flooded Europe, and with them, a quiet marketing campaign for officer fashion. Young men, especially the upwardly mobile, began to mimic what they saw in portraits. The result? A veritable sock renaissance in civilian fashion. Tailors in London, Milan, and even Philadelphia began advertising continental anklewear and French officer hosiery, as depicted in recent victories. Sock catalogs from the 1810s are filled with heroic-sounding names like the Austerlitz Weave and the Marshal's Rib. One British satirical magazine even grumbled, "Every apprentice now wishes to die nobly in expensive socks." Collectors emerged too, both then and now. Even today, museums and private collectors quietly compete over surviving pairs of Napoleonic-era officer stockings. The Musée de l'Armée in Paris houses an entire drawer labeled Hosiery of Distinction, including a remarkably well-preserved violet silk pair once belonging to Marshal Berthier. They are so fine they appear almost translucent. And one historian reportedly whispered, "They look like they could float away if breathed on." Some pairs were preserved not for their luxury, but their stories. One is singed at the heel, worn by an officer who reportedly walked through a collapsing barn while rescuing villagers. Another has tiny blood stains near the garter seam, never cleaned, never spoken of, simply labeled worn at Jena, 1806. Even in pristine condition, these socks are not just garments, they're artifacts, fragments of identity, courage, and yes, ego. And sock design didn't just stop with the wars. The styles seen on generals filtered down into court fashion, then into the wardrobes of wealthy merchants and provincial lawyers. Even after Napoleon's fall, the imperial ankle remained a desirable look. Clean lines, snug fit, a dash of luxury beneath layers of conformity. It was the quiet signal. I may be wearing a wig, but my calves still remember glory. What's fascinating is how the meaning of socks shifted depending on context. In one arena, they were tools of seduction, glimpsed in dance halls beneath swirling coattails. In another, they were symbols of martial discipline, proof of a man's refinement, even when caked in battlefield mud. Artists picked up on this duality. In some portraits, socks peeked like secrets. In others, they beamed like medals. One painter even created a whole series called The Gentleman's Step, focusing entirely on officers' feet. It sounds like a niche market, and it was. But wealthy clients lined up to have their own socks immortalized in oils. Only in Napoleonic France could a man gaze proudly at a painting of his shins and feel he'd captured his legacy. The obsession didn't fade easily. Well into the 1820s, post-war dandies in Paris were still commissioning sock patterns inspired by military figures. Some went for replicas, exact copies of designs worn at Marengo or Eylau. Others asked for interpretive tributes, including one absurd pair shaped like cannons at the ankle, complete with tiny tassels. So now, as you stroll through a gallery frozen in time, past stern faces and powdered brows, pay attention to the corners of the canvas. Look for that flicker of fabric where boot meets trouser. There, in the quietest part of the painting, lies a little rebellion, a little ego, and maybe even a little longing. Because no matter how grand the battles or how gilded the frames, even the most celebrated men knew, if you're going to be remembered, make sure they paint your socks right. The war is over now. Or at least, the shouting has stopped. You're walking through the aftermath, not the smoking ruins of towns or bloodied fields, but something stranger. Markets, museums, and the dusty shelves of collectors. The empire has fallen, but the socks, they march on. In the decades after Napoleon's defeat, something peculiar happened. While swords were sheathed and medals tucked away in drawers, officer socks became prized relics. Some were kept by descendants, neatly folded in cedar chests alongside fading love letters. Others surfaced in estate auctions, sold as curiosities to dandies, tailors, and military romantics. A few even made their way into medical museums, studied not for style, but for their unique patterns of wear and strain. You're in one such museum now, an old, quiet place in the French countryside. The room smells of parchment and beeswax. In a glass case, under soft golden light, sits a pair of cream-colored silk stockings with pale green tassels. The label reads, "Allegedly worn by a junior officer at Austerlitz, donated anonymously." Historians still argue whether they're authentic, but as you stare at the delicate threading and faint heel stains, it doesn't matter. Real or not, they carry weight. Sock collecting became a minor obsession in the 19th century. There were journals with names like The Gentleman's Calf and Threaded Valor, which reviewed vintage Martial hosiery with an alarming level of detail. One entry from 1837 praises a dusky lavender blend believed to have survived the retreat from Moscow, though admits the toe is suspiciously unstained. Yes, sock forensics was a thing. The fascination wasn't just nostalgia, it was also fashion. Inspired by the officer aesthetic, a whole generation of post-war dandies adopted the campaign calf look. High socks with reinforced heels, subtle stitching along the side seams, and garters embroidered with faux regimental crests. They strutted through salons quoting Bonaparte and adjusting their cuffs like veterans, though their most strenuous march was often between wine bars. In England, the obsession took a slightly mocking tone. Satirical prints showed ex-officers offering lectures titled How to Conquer with Comfort, flanked by shelves of silk socks. One comic depicted Napoleon in exile, surrounded not by maps or guns, but a mountain of laundry, captioned Emperor of the Ankle. Yet even the mockery couldn't hide the admiration. Sock style had become aspirational, no matter which side you were on. There was even an economic boom in sock reproduction. Tailors and haberdashers began marketing Bonaparte line collections, historically inspired hosiery with modern materials. Ads promised campaign comfort, Parisian pride, and included testimonials like wore them to a duel, won and felt dashing. The line between parody and product blurred, and the sock marched into middle-class wardrobes with surprising ease. Museums, too, played a part. As military museums expanded in the late 1800s, curators began to realize how many donors were offering not swords or coats, but socks. Fragile, fragrant, and sometimes still carrying sachets of herbs, these humble objects forced curators to rethink what war stories looked like. One famously sniffy curator at the Invalides reportedly refused to display a sock exhibit until a visitor pointed out that Napoleon's surgeon had once written 400 words on the spiritual benefit of warm hosiery. Even today, a few of these socks survive, not in the main exhibits, but in side drawers and storage vaults, wrapped in archival paper and scented slightly with old cedar. Some are lace-trimmed, some are dull brown wool, worn almost transparent at the heel, and yet all of them whisper the same quiet truth. There was life beneath the boots. In a modern context, these socks continue to inspire. Fashion designers have referenced them in runway shows, blending historical motifs with contemporary stretch fabric. High-end sock brands offer Napoleonic officer collections with names like the Marengo Twist and General's Garter. Even cosplay circles have embraced the legacy, creating historically accurate replicas that cost more than a month's rent in 1805. It's funny, isn't it? For all the battles fought, treaties signed, and monuments built, what remains with us, what has endured, is something soft, intimate, and mostly hidden. A pair of socks, lovingly knit, a garter stitched with initials, a diary entry about silk against skin. That's what history is sometimes. Not thunder, not glory. Just a man, his sore feet, and a little bit of lavender. And so, as the wind down begins, you find yourself drifting not through smoke or clamor, but through scent. A soft herbal perfume lingers. The museum is quiet now. The gallery lights dim. The world of officers and elegance and marching boots fades gently, and you're left with a single, calming image. A warm pair of socks resting quietly on a footlocker, waiting to be worn again. The ankle aches less. The silk is cool to the touch. You close your eyes. Somewhere in the distance, drums no longer sound. Just the slow, steady rhythm of breath. Warm, still, safe. So now the boots are off. The campfires have burned low, and the echo of marching has long since faded. You're no longer in the damp fields of Bavaria or the crowded salons of Paris. You're tucked in, safe, floating through the quiet corridors of memory where socks were more than fabric. They were shields, tiny comforts wrapped around tired legs, symbols of pride, hope, and maybe a little absurdity. Let your breath slow. Inhale softly through your nose, like lavender warming on a hearth. Exhale, like the sigh of an officer sinking onto his cot after hours of drilling, feeling the gentle embrace of well-fitted hosiery around his ankles. You're there with him, not in the smoke or the gunfire, but in that still moment when the world is nothing but soft fabric and silence. The images drift away now. Portraits framed in gold, dusty trunks in attics, a love letter with thread marks, a sock slipping gently down a boot. You don't need to follow them anymore. Let them fall behind like footsteps in the snow, fading into a quiet hush. Everything is slower now. The world feels wrapped in wool, cozy, dim, a little silly, but in the best way. Good. That's it. Let it all melt into the softness. Let the battlefields become bedrooms. And let your last waking thought be this: even in the most chaotic times, someone somewhere was trying to keep their ankles warm, and maybe, just maybe, look fabulous doing it.